He was deemed a menace confined behind formidable steel barriers. Without a name or any callers, he was surrounded by only quietness and doubt. Formerly a distinguished K9 who had performed his duties with distinction, he was now regarded as a potential threat following a solitary, mysterious biting incident. Nobody inquired about the cause. Nobody showed concern for the actual events until a particular man arrived. An unfamiliar individual bearing his own wounds, a history he kept concealed, and a soft-spoken appeal, "Present to me the one you have lost, Hope, Indiana." The events that ensued were more than a mere rescue. It was an accounting involving a neglected dog, a tormented veteran, and a connection destined to reveal a hidden reality nobody anticipated. On the outskirts of Tacoma, Washington, distant from the urban clamor and concealed behind extensive chain-link fences, stands a cement facility not featured in polished pamphlets. This establishment is not the type to display young dogs for adoption pictures. It is the place where they house the individuals no one wishes to discuss, the quiet ones, those designated as perilous. And beyond one of those robust steel entrances, solitary in a confinement inadequate for his past, resided a German shepherd. Devoid of a name or a collar, there was only a metallic identifier fastened to the enclosure. K9-47. Less a designation, more an alarm. People no longer communicated with him, not in any meaningful sense. Personnel moved past his confinement as if it were an explosive device ready to detonate. A swift glance. A food tray pushed beneath the barrier. Even the custodian detoured to avoid him. His record indicated he had bitten his handler. That was nearly all the information deemed necessary. They failed to investigate why a distinguished K9 abruptly changed. They did not inquire about the catalyst. He was simply secured and categorized as a risk, a menace. A termination date had been unofficially, softly murmured. Perhaps only weeks remained. However, K9-47 was not hostile, at least not in the manner they anticipated. He made no attempt to rush the entrance or bite at motion. He did not even emit a bark. His action was to wait. Each evening, as the light waned and filtered through the single restricted casement, he would emerge from the dimness and lean against the enclosure. Only his head would turn unhurriedly as if he were anticipating an arrival. Or perhaps recalling someone who never came. He had become thinner, his fur had lost its sheen, not due to advancing years, but due to quietude. The sort of quietude that does more than occupy a space, it permeates one's being. Still, within his gaze, something lingered, a glimmer of contemplation, of inquiry, of aspiration. It was difficult to discern. That is the nature of trauma. It rarely shouts. Occasionally, it merely bides its time. The other canines would bark, gyrate, and jump when personnel passed by. K9-47 did not. He remained standing, gazing fixedly, as though each jingle of keys or thud of boots could be the signal he anticipated. One officer had quipped that the dog was possessed. Another referred to him as a phantom in a fur costume, yet none of them truly peered into his enclosure. None ventured until the sound of boots approached. Not hurried, not swift, but consistent, unhurried footfalls along the rear passage. Heavy, like the sounds of saws, rain-drenched, reverberating off the frigid tiles, akin to a metronome ticking towards an event no one could precisely identify. The personnel did not initially identify the man. No chart, no beaming grin, merely a worn coat, a military patch partially detached from the sleeve, and a gaze that rarely wavered. His gait suggested someone accustomed to shouldering burdens for an extended period. He went past the compliant, the enthusiastic, the disciplined animals and then halted directly before K9-47. For a complete 10 seconds, stillness reigned. It was not a confrontation. It was different. A quietude too profound to be accidental. The dog did not pounce, nor did he snarl. He simply gazed, head down, respiration unhurried, and a change occurred as if the very silence had been altered. John Raines hadn't said a word yet. But when he eventually did, his words were not an inquiry. They were not even an order. They were a declaration. Soft, resolute, just audible enough to make the nearby handler startle. "This is the one I am here for." John arrived without a rescue apparatus or a strategy. He made no inquiries about the operational procedures. He did not ask about the behavioral assessments K9-47 had undergone, whether successful or not. He posed no questions at all. He simply remained there, moisture still seeping from his sleeves, anticipating a refusal. Yet no one objected because his demeanor possessed an unnerving quality. Not hostile, but resolute, like an individual who had witnessed too much damage to be perturbed by another instance. The personnel exchanged glances. The junior member began to speak, likely intending to propose an alternative dog, one with favorable prospects, recent obedience instruction, perhaps even one that presented well in photographs. But John didn't move. His gaze remained locked on the dog as if attempting to recall a distant memory or perhaps identify something concealed beneath wounds and quietude. "Sir, this dog is not approved for adoption," the supervisor eventually stated, advancing with a rigid stance as if anticipating a confrontation. "I am not adopting," John replied calmly. "I am making a request." "Requesting what?" "The one that nobody desires." Now, that is not an expression commonly heard in such an establishment. The majority of individuals prefer adorable or, at a minimum, remediable animals. But John showed no reaction. He did not recoil when the dog advanced, its paws moving silently on the cement. No barking, no whimpering, merely its being there. The atmosphere between them grew tense. There was no spectacle, no pouncing, no requirement for orders. The dog did not perceive a savior. It perceived something different, something it had not witnessed for a considerable duration. It perceived acknowledgement. John squatted unhurriedly, his knees creaking like aged timber under strain, and placed his forearms on his thighs. For several moments, he simply observed, truly observed, in the manner one examines a reflection in shattered glass. Then, in a tone so subdued that the handler next to him had to incline his head to hear, he uttered, "They informed me you were damaged," John stated, his gaze fixed on the dog. "That makes both of us." The supervisor paused. "You are unaware of what you are requesting. This animal has a history. He is categorized as aggressive. He bit a handler. It almost led to the handler's dismissal. I reviewed the report. Then you are aware he poses a threat." John gradually stood upright. "Have you ever been designated dangerous for not adhering to directives that lacked logic? Have you ever faced repercussions for acting correctly but unconventionally?" The inquiry was not directed at any specific person. It lingered, weighty. K9-47 remained still, yet a subtle relaxation occurred in his stance. Merely a tiny bit. A change so minute that most would not have perceived it. But John did. "Allow me in the room with him," he stated. The personnel gazed as if he had requested to grapple with an explosive device, but regulations yielded after a sufficient period of quiet. Documents were generated. A liability release was presented, the type stipulating, should you suffer the loss of a hand, it is your responsibility. John affixed his signature without perusal. The enclosure entrance glided open for the initial time in many weeks. The dog did not jump, he did not rush. He advanced as if still determining the reality of the situation. John remained there, motionless, allowing the instant to extend. One pace, then a subsequent one. Then the dog was before him, his respiration consistent, yet subdued. His tail did not move. His ears did not stand alert, but he sat. Simply sat. That sufficed. The personnel could not comprehend it, nor could they elucidate it. However, certain matters do not require comprehension. Some instances occur simply because they are meant to, because two damaged entities occasionally connect more effectively than two flawless ones ever could. John tilted his head slightly in the direction of the handlers. "He requires release. I have room. He is accompanying me." "You will require authorization from command," one of them mumbled. "I will obtain it." And he succeeded. Because when an individual enters an establishment such as this, seeking not a companion animal but a mirror image, documentation has a peculiar tendency to move aside. By the following morning, the precipitation had ceased, yet the strain persisted. The atmosphere within the establishment felt peculiar, as if its customary operations had been altered during the night. John Raines was at the reception counter, holding a folder marked with coffee and a writing instrument that was past its prime. The documents he possessed were not entirely formal. Then again, he himself was not entirely conventional. He was not adhering to protocol, he was skillfully manipulating it. The sort of skill acquired only when one's existence has hinged on the selection of words and the omission of others. "I have authorization from Colonel West," he stated unemotionally. The attendant blinked. "You are referring to the retired Colonel West?" John did not raise his eyes. "He still answers his telephone. That is what is significant." The waiver was exchanged between individuals like an object too hot to handle. His signature was already set. Releases of liability. Authorization for temporary guardianship. A marginal notation scrawled in dark ink. Unofficial transfer pending assessment. Atypical situation. In other words, should an issue arise, all parties will feign ignorance of this event. K9-47 was released on a chain leash, his head held down, yet his eyes were keen, interpreting every motion, every respiration, every subtle movement in John's physique. The tightness was not hostility, it was recollection. And though all observers regarded him with doubt, the dog did not lash out or struggle. He simply entered the carrier in the rear of John's aged pickup truck without reluctance. The sort of compliance that stemmed not from orders but from intuition. The vehicle vibrated as it traveled, its old suspension system creaking under the burden of quietude. John remained silent. The dog did likewise. Sunlight pierced the foliage as they journeyed northeast, navigating the winding country roads toward a small dwelling nestled at the verge of a woodland area near Spokane. It was a modest place, an aged wooden building with a veranda supported by recollections and tenacious fastenings. But it was peaceful, and peace was the primary requirement for both of them. John stopped the truck, emerged from the driver's side, and unlatched the carrier entrance. He did not cajole, nor did he tempt with rewards. He merely left the entrance ajar and moved away. The dog remained within for a brief period, blinking at the trees, the breeze, the novel aroma of liberation. Then one paw extended, then another, and soon he was on the earth, as if assessing whether the ground beneath him might disappear. There were no barriers, no collars, only expanse. Expanse for movement, expanse for decision. John offloaded provisions while the dog observed him from afar. No barks, no scurrying, just quietude. That evening, John prepared a diluted coffee and sat on the veranda, his legs extended, his hands joined as if cradling an unseen object. The dog did not approach, yet he did not vanish either. He rested on the lawn, his eyes partly shut, oriented toward the trees, toward the unfamiliar. Hours elapsed, then a sound arose, soft, delicate, a faint whimper, nearly too faint to detect. It was not an expression of discomfort. It was not an expression of alarm. It was something entirely different, something deeply concealed. John looked towards its origin, without moving, without uttering a word. He simply attended. "I understand," he murmured into the darkness. "I perceive it as well." The words effected no immediate change, but the dog's ears twitched. His frame relaxed slightly. And when the breeze rustled the trees once more, he did not raise his head. He remained, not due to obligation, but because, for the first time in a significant while, he was able to. The subsequent days unfolded unhurriedly, resembling aged film strips with imperfections at the edges. Subdued, indistinct, yet imbued with a palpable strain. John spoke infrequently, and the dog maintained its distance. They coexisted like two specters inhabiting the same dwelling, moving through concurrent daily cycles. However, within the quietude, routines started to emerge. Each morning, the dog would position himself by the casement, not vocalizing, not restlessly moving, merely observing the woodland as if anticipating an appearance from within. Each afternoon, he would meander to the forest edge, test the air, then come back and recline just distant enough from the veranda to avoid being perceived as a companion animal. He was not seeking affection. His tail did not wag. He was observing, protecting. Yet, the nature of the threat he was guarding against, John had not yet comprehended. Then the initial tempest arrived. It struck unexpectedly, sweeping over the pine trees with a shrieking gale and substantial, irate precipitation that lashed the cabin as if with malicious intent. John had endured greater hardships. He remained indoors, perusing an outdated field manual that was no longer applicable. Outside, however, the dog was agitated. It commenced with restless movement, then snarling, followed by a profound, throaty bark that did not signify defense. It resonated like alarm attempting to maintain composure. John seized his coat and torch, went out onto the veranda, and surveyed the open area. The dog was at the forefront, covered in mire, his limbs rigid and his gaze fixed on the gloom. Rain poured off him, yet he remained steadfast. He snarled deeply, ears flattened, as if an unseen entity had marked a boundary on the ground that he would not permit to be violated. Nothing was present. At least, nothing John could discern. But upon closer inspection, he noticed it, marks in the soil. Not recent, not profound, but intentional. Symmetrical lines as if talons had scraped through. It might have been a cougar. Perhaps a bear, but the feeling was different. It felt more significant, more emblematic, as though whatever had scarred the earth had done so for the dog's discovery. The dog did not pounce. He did not pursue. He merely stood, quivering with an emotion akin to recollection or apprehension. John squatted next to him and extended his hand, not to offer comfort but to examine his paw. It was mildly bleeding. He must have trod on something. What was noteworthy was not the wound itself, but the response. The dog did not withdraw. He did not snarl. He simply remained there, permitting John to cleanse the injury with a piece of fabric faintly scented with disinfectant and coffee. And it was then that John perceived it, not the alarm, not the discomfort, but the culpability. The sort of culpability that burdens even the blameless. the kind that arises not from misstep, but from the conviction that one was the cause of a negative outcome even without explicit accusation. Back within the cabin, John did not dry the dog nor entice him inside with sustenance. He opened the entrance and left it so. The dog paused initially. Then, following a deep inhalation and a shake of his drenched coat, he entered and settled near the hearth. Not for heat, but for closeness. It was not yet solace, but it was progress. Later that evening, the gale subsided and the rain lessened to a light shower. John sat at the kitchen counter, his hands cupping a beverage that had grown cool. He gazed at the entrance, partially anticipating the dog's departure. But he did not leave. He remained. And when John murmured into the stillness, uncertain of his audience, the dog raised his head slightly. "Whatever transpired previously, I am certain it was not your doing." The dog did not stir, but he did not avert his gaze either. It was on a Tuesday that John resolved to assess the unseen boundary between endurance and reliance. The cabin had settled into a peaceful cadence: nourishment, repose, observation, repetition. The dog no longer snarled in his slumber, yet the rigidity in his shoulders remained. He moved with the bearing of a serviceman, perpetually alert, every fiber tensed for a command that was never issued. Consequently, John attached a leash, not for the purpose of restraint, but as a declaration. We are embarking on a journey. United, they proceeded northward, into denser woodlands where the trees appeared ancient, predating their very existences. No defined walkway existed, only a faint track of fragmented leaves and gnarled roots, decipherable solely by those familiar with the area. The dog ambled alongside John with unexpected facility, neither keen nor reluctant, until their arrival at the stream. It was constricted, merely a few feet in breadth, the water level barely reaching the ankle, the sort of stream where youngsters might frolic in warmer months and deer would imbibe without hesitation. Yet, the instant the dog perceived it, a complete transformation occurred. His frame became rigid, not with the stiffness of discipline, but with the stiffness of sheer dread. His limbs were rooted. His respiration altered, coming in profound, brief gasps as if he had sustained a blow to his solar plexus. He did not snarl. He did not flee. He simply became immobile. His attention was riveted on the undulating surface of the water, as if it were an insurmountable barrier. John halted, remained silent, did not tug, merely stood by his side, observing the same water, perceiving none of what the dog perceived, yet experiencing all of it. Then the sound emerged, low, quivering, as though the dog had suppressed a whimper and could no longer contain it. His tail drooped, his ears flattened. His eyes blinked unhurriedly, not from weariness, but from self-control, the sort of self-control witnessed in someone endeavoring to maintain composure in a public setting. John remained stationary. He merely delved into his pocket, retrieved a morsel of dried venison, placed it at his feet, and seated himself on a proximate stone. Not for instruction, not for inducement, but to await. Minutes went by. The dog did not stir. John produced a compact notebook he had carried. He did not inscribe in it. He merely turned its pages. Each was filled with jotted recollections he did not articulate. Coordinates from assignments, names encircled, annotations concerning matters he could not erase from memory but also chose not to clarify. The journal was not for his own benefit. Not any longer. It was for an entity that did not communicate verbally but required the understanding that quietude did not equate to non-existence. In due course, the dog reclined beside the stream, still not venturing across, still not mended, but not absconding either. He stayed nearer than previously, observing the water as if it harbored a specter he could not dispel. Perhaps it did. That evening, upon returning to the cabin, the dog did not pace before the entrance as was his custom. Instead, he sat with his back to the casement, his gaze intermittently wandering toward the gloom but never fully fixating upon it. It was not tranquility, not yet, but it was a novel development. It was the commencement of confronting his fears with someone who would not depart when circumstances became quiescent. The dwelling possessed an outbuilding at the rear, partly obscured by climbing plants, with an entrance that creaked its objection each time John manipulated it. Within, the aroma was of aged timber, lubricant, and unremembered cold seasons. One afternoon, While seeking cordage to mend the poultry netting on the barrier, John observed a container. It was concealed beneath a protective sheet and an ancient military duffel bag that had remained undisturbed for many years. He had no recollection of stowing it there. Such is the mechanism of sorrow. It archives items in recesses of memory that one tends to shun. He extracted it, cleared off the accumulated particles, and unfastened the clasps. Within lay strata of bygone times, neatly arranged fatigues, an emergency field kit, a fractured image of his former unit. The recollections were not clamorous. They did not shriek. They simply were. However, beneath the final stratum of equipment lay an unusual item. An envelope. It was secured. No sender's address, merely a military tracking identifier, partially indistinct. Inquisitiveness overcame reluctance. John unsealed it carefully as if the paper itself might inflict harm. Inside was a solitary photograph, its colors faded, its corners creased. It depicted a German shepherd standing erect and dignified in a full tactical harness, accompanied by a youthful soldier whose visage had been deliberately obliterated, not obscured, but repeatedly and forcefully scratched over. John gazed. The atmosphere behind him seemed to rarefy. The dog was at the entrance to the outbuilding, motionless. He had approached without a sound, but now he emitted a low, steady growl, not directed at John, but at the image, not the physical paper, but the memory it evoked. The growl diminished into a distinct bark. One, then another, followed by quietude once more. John lowered the photograph, allowing the dog to investigate it with his nose. The response was instantaneous. The dog retreated, ears lowered, tail tucked, not in alarm, but with an emotion more akin to profound apprehension, as if the photograph had dredged something from deep within him to the forefront. That evening, John did not kindle a blaze. He sat in the kitchen, illuminated only by the buzzing overhead fixture, the photograph resting on the table. The dog moved in constricted circuits, agitated, his ears perpetually angled towards the woodland. Something was reawakening. John picked up the telephone. It rang 5 times before a harsh voice responded. Rains, the voice stated. Yes, I require assistance. You invariably require assistance. I need information regarding an AK-9 transfer from Fairchild, unit code Delta 74. Shadow. There is an anomaly in this record. A lengthy silence ensued. Then that case was marked, concealed beneath internal documentation. You are not authorized to possess it. Well, I do. Are you certain you wish to investigate that? I do not wish to. I am compelled to. There was no farewell, merely the sound of a disconnected line. Later that evening, the dog vocalized with a howl. Not once, not directed outside, but from the very depths of the cabin. The sound resonated through the structure like a message too agonizing to articulate in any other manner. It was elemental, mournful. It did not stem from physical harm. It originated from something tormenting his inner thoughts. John opened the main entrance and went out onto the veranda, admitting the chill nocturnal air. He did not summon the dog. He did not order him to cease. He simply remained there and waited. In due course, the howling ceased. The dog materialized in the entranceway, his chest rising and falling, his paws moist. His gaze met John's, not fearful, but questioning, imploring, and for the initial time, John did not avert his eyes. He moved to the side and left the entrance fully open. The dog showed no reluctance. He entered and reclined beside the base of John's chair. This was not compliance. This was not conditioning. This was capitulation, not to an individual, but to a reality that had finally been permitted to surface. The journey to Fairchild Air Force Base was extensive, yet John did not hurry. He maintained a firm grip on the steering mechanism with one hand while the other lay on the central armrest, palm upwards, mere inches from the dog resting at his side. The dog remained awake. He observed the thoroughfare, his ears reacting to each passing large vehicle, each gust of air that buffeted the aged truck. Neither spoke, as quietude had by this point evolved into their shared vernacular. Upon traversing the security entrance, John presented his retired authorization and was permitted entry with minimal delay. The sentry glanced at the dog and commented under his breath, "He appears to recall this location." And he did. They stopped near an old aircraft maintenance building that had not been utilized for combat readiness for a considerable time. It currently functioned as a repository for archived documents that no one wished to handle but could not legally dispose of. John was met by an individual in a creased uniform garment, Sergeant Mitchell, long since retired yet still involved in all significant respects. "Uncertain what you anticipate discovering?" Reins, Mitchell remarked, guiding him into the reverberating metallic structure. Certain records are best left undisturbed. I am not seeking trivial information. I am seeking a reality that was omitted from the official documents. Mitchell paused by a series of secured cabinets, forcefully opened one with a creak that seemed to awaken something, and retrieved a substantial manila folder labeled K9-47. Incident report. The information within was not unexpected, but the specifics affected John more profoundly than he anticipated. The dog had participated in an operation with his handler, a youthful officer lauded for his command abilities but privately censured for indecisiveness under duress. During a realistic training exercise involving simulated civilian extractions, an unforeseen event placed a civilian participant in genuine jeopardy. The handler became immobilized. The dog did not. He bit the handler not as an act of insubordination but to rouse him from his stupor. And it was effective. The handler responded. The civilian was moved to safety. And the operation was, by technical standards, successful. However, in the subsequent period, there was awkwardness, disgrace, internal politics, and a dog who had acted on his intuition. An intuition that had preserved a life was categorized as a menace. The handler authored the report himself: hostility, uninitiated, perilous conduct. The chain of command, unable to risk a public disgrace, concealed the matter. A quiet dismissal, seclusion, removal from the roster of heroes, retired into quietude. John perused each page unhurriedly, meticulously. The dog lay beside him throughout, composed, stable, yet not entirely still. He was aware. In some manner, he was aware that the burden which had pursued him like a malediction had never truly been his. John rose. His throat felt constricted, but his articulation was distinct. You did not err. You performed as you were conditioned to, and they lacked the fortitude to acknowledge their own failure concerning you. Outside, the wind intensified once more. The dog gazed towards the structure as if he identified the aroma of perfidy in the atmosphere, but his frame was no longer rigid. His tail did not tuck. He stood with dignity. The return journey was altered. John spoke infrequently, but when he did, his words were not disjointed. I once believed quietude signified tranquility, he said gently. But at times, quietude is merely what remains after the truth has been suppressed. The dog did not avert his gaze. He observed John with a stillness that required no interpretation. And in that unvoiced interchange, a transformation occurred. The leash had been a mere convention. Now it was simply a segment of nylon connecting two individuals who had endured, who finally understood they were not solitary in their perseverance. The return path from Fairchild was tranquil, yet not devoid of substance. The sort of tranquility that possessed significance, as if a hallowed object had recently been exhumed and required space to exist. John remained silent. He had no need for words. The dog sat attentively in the passenger's seat, not apprehensive, not diverted, simply there. His gaze was fixed on the road before them, but his body was finally in a state of repose, as if a long-concealed aspect of his being had been identified and liberated. By the time of their arrival back at the cabin, the sun was descending beyond the evergreen trees, tinting the sky's periphery with hues of profound reddish-brown. John unlatched the entrance, allowed the truck to proceed inward, and switched off the motor unceremoniously. The dog alighted and tested the air, not with apprehension but with purpose. He was not on patrol, he was recalling something. John observed him traverse the grounds unhurriedly, as if drawn by an unseen force. Then the dog halted just beyond the clearing's edge near the shallow stream. His body became motionless, tail down, head inclined slightly towards the water, and without reluctance he entered it. On the prior occasion he had become immobile, rigid, quivering at the brink. But now he navigated through it, step by step, the water creating ripples but offering no opposition. He reached the opposite bank and stood quietly for an extended moment. Then, with no audible sound save for his respiration, he commenced digging. Initially, John surmised he was merely disturbing the mud. But then, a glimpse of material emerged, brown, discolored, ripped. It was a harness, aged, hardened with soil. One of the cushion bands still bore a faint, imprinted serial identifier. The dog prodded it with his nose, then positioned himself beside it, not as if he had discovered a valuable item, but as if he had located a final resting place. John traversed the stream and squatted next to him. He handled the harness delicately, brushed away the grime, and inverted it. There, faintly engraved on the leather underside, was a scratched nameplate. The characters were barely discernible: Unit Shadow, It was no accident. This was not merely the location where the dog had been abandoned. It was where he had remained in solitude, steadfast. Every day since, John did not utter a word. He took the harness, put it in the truck's cargo area, and transported them both to their dwelling. That evening, he did not write in his journal. He did not mend the barrier. He sat at the kitchen counter with the harness nearby, and he composed a solitary letter directed to the K-9 unit at Fairchild, not to lodge a grievance, not to issue a menace, but simply to rectify. He conveyed to them the facts concerning the bite, the concealment, what this dog had performed, and how he had been treated in consequence. He dispatched it the subsequent morning. No identifying mark, just a straightforward declaration at the conclusion. He was never the issue. You were. 1 week thereafter, a reply was received. Official stationery, concise and impersonal. The dog's file had been updated. His designation altered, exonerated. No longer deemed a risk. John had the letter framed, not for his own sake, but because the dog merited tangible evidence. He affixed it beside the hearth, at a height where the dog could view it daily. That evening, the dog settled beside it, paws interlocked, eyes partly shut, no restless movement, no twitching, only quietude. And the following morning, as sunlight penetrated the casement and bathed the room in a golden glow, the dog approached John on the veranda and placed his chin on John's knee. Not for sustenance, not for commendation, simply for connection. No leash, no directive, just reliance. And that constituted everything.